Hey, what's up guys? I'm Hardleg Joe. For more than a year now, I've been making a little show called What a Deck. For those of you who are new here, What a Deck is a weekly Yu-Gi-Oh! Show where I make a rogue or troll deck and then showcase it off in 10 duels against random opponents. Now, generally on the show, I try to stick away from cards and decks that make up the meta. Not only because I have more fun trying to find unique ways to topple the meta, but because the meta is usually made up of the most overpowered cards in the game. Cards that are prime candidates for the next ban list. I want the decks on What a Deck to have some staying power. I want the profiles to be useful and entertaining for months, if not years after I make them, so I stick away from anything I think might be banned in the future. Despite my best attempts, however, many of my decks have ended up with hits from the ban hammer, or they've just been power creeped out of existence. So in this video, I'm going to go over every deck from the first year of What a Deck. I'm going to show how each one has been affected by the ban list since then, how relevant it is in the current meta, and what changes I would make if I was trying to make them competitive today. Settle down and grab a snake, because we have 52 decks to cover. Before we begin though, a quick note on Acton Knight. While it's forbidden now, Acton Knight was once a rank 4 staple for a while, and I played him in pretty much every deck that could make him. However, he wasn't key to any deck's strategy, was never played in more than one, and can be replaced with pretty much any generic rank 4 Ixie. So for the sake of keeping things brief and not repeating myself, I'm just not going to mention him when he comes up. With that out of the way, let's look at my very first deck. Number 1, Last Warrior's Wild Ride. I originally played Rhoda at 3, and it is now limited. I'd replace one of them with Upstart Goblin, and replace the other one with Messenger of Peace for added stall. I'd say this deck is no longer competitive, but that would imply it was competitive in the first place. Last Warrior's Wild Ride was a troll deck in the biggest sense of the word. It was made at a time before I had any sort of standards for the show, and as such it lost quite a lot. I tried to make it recently and couldn't get it to win pretty much at all, so I don't think it's even worth trying to salvage. Number 2, Six Samurai Toolbox. Once again, I originally played Rhoda at 3 and now it's at 1. I'd replace it with another Anishi, since it's a good card that you can no longer search without using Rhoda, as well as a third Triple Impact, since you need OTK more in this current format than you need before. You could also replace one of these with an Upstart Goblin if you want, since this deck usually OTKs with more than 9,000 damage. This version of Six Samurais has unfortunately been power creeped out of usefulness. They can still OTK if you go second and get a good hand and your opponent doesn't negate your summons, but they're too much of a glass cannon. Once again, I attempted to make this deck when its year came around, hoping that I'd be able to strike gold again, because this deck did really good the first time around. But in the end, it really just came down to a coin toss. If you get a really great hand, you can OTK. If not, well, then you're just screwed. Deck number 3, Melodious Superman. No changes required. Unfortunately, this deck isn't really viable anymore, just due to the prevalence of Solemn Strike, Kaijus, and non-targeting mass removal like the Monarch Storm 4th, Storming Mirror Force, Drowning Mirror Force, etc. Against certain decks, they can still pack a punch. Maybe good for locals or casual play, assuming no one has any Kaijus. But otherwise, I don't think there's anything you could add to this to make it more competitive without completely changing around what you're trying to do with it. Number 4, Level 1 Skull Servants. No changes required. This was another complete troll deck that wasn't really competitive at the first place. Unlike Last Warrior's Wild Ride though, this can still work. You could still OTK if you get lucky. So if you wanted to play it, it works about as good as it did back then. Not really much you could update about it though. Maybe throw in a few Shiranui Spectral Swords for slightly more recovering, add some synchro plays to that. Otherwise, I wouldn't really bother with this one. Deck number 5, Captain Cardsworth's Board to Deck. No changes required. Again, this is a complete and utter troll deck that wasn't competitive at the time and has only gotten less competitive. Still, if you wanted to run a stall, this one could be rejuvenated with some new staples. Ross Fear Mode and Aroma Jar are both pretty good, but I'm personally not interested in running stall decks again, as they take forever and they're really boring to watch. Number 6, Master of Oz Dynamite. Once again, I played Rhoda at 3, and it's now at 1. I also played Chicken Game at 3 in this deck, which is now completely banned. This might be one of the few decks that just simply doesn't work anymore. Really, what made this work in the first place was Chicken Game. You use it to lower your life points and draw cards so that you could OTK by using Megamorph on Master of Oz, since Megamorph doubles his attack if your life points are lower. But there's not really a replacement for Chicken Game, and even if Chicken Game was legal, there's a lot more decks now that'll summon huge 3,000 attack point beat sticks, or they'll summon floater monsters in defense position that can just keep up a wall. both of which would prevent Master of Oz from attacking directly or doing enough damage to OTK. So this is really just a bust all around. Number 7, Ninja Samorg Lockdown. Yet again, I played Rhoda at 3, and that is now limited. I'd replace one of them with an Upstart Goblin, since this is a lockdown deck, life points don't really matter as much. The other one you could replace with either Mask of Restrict or Fogblade. This deck is weak to having their monsters tributed as well as monster effects, and it runs on continuous traps, so either one would fit in pretty nicely. This one is still a possible rogue contender against any deck that needs spell traps, but its weakness to monster effects leaves it vulnerable to big hitters in the current meta. Things like ABC Dragon Cannon, PK Fire, and Blue Eyes, all of which can function almost entirely on monster effects, just ruin it. It may be a little bit slow, but if we ever go into a format that's more spell trap heavy, I think this could definitely make a resurgence. Especially if we ever get any more ninja support. I mean, good ninja support. Deck number 8, UA Toolbox Turbo. I'm actually not really going to go into this one, because I already made a 2016 version of the deck that's just an improved version of this deck. And while that new version did get hit by the most recent ban list in the form of the Monarch Storm 4th, it wasn't in the first year, so I'm not really going to cover it at the moment, and there's always a chance that Storm 4th will come back by then. Number 9, Ignite Exodia. No changes required. This deck is actually still about as competitive as it was back then. It's kind of a troll deck that relies on getting Heart of the Underdog, but even without that, it's still a pretty decent Ignite deck. Just replace the generic normal pendulums that I put in here originally with the new Ignites like Veteran and Cavalier, then bump up the extra deck with newer Ixies like Utopia Beyond, and you've essentially got an Exodia deck that can actually hold its own in a fight and even OTK at times. Just madness. Number 10, Chronomaly Artifact Reptilians. No changes required. Unfortunately, this deck has been power creeped into oblivion. All this deck really does is make one rank 4 or 5 Ixie each turn, and there just aren't enough heavy hitter 4 or 5s that can hold a game on their own. Well, maybe Cyber Infinity Dragon, but this deck is only partially machined, so it's not going to be the most consistent play. Chronomaly Reptilians still do have a viable combo. They can do the Machu Mech OTK, which is always fun, but you'd have to rework this entire deck from the ground up to make it do that consistently. Comment in the comments if you'd like to see me try. Could give it a go in the future. Number 11, Negate and Destroy. No changes required. This is actually still a pretty decent deck, assuming you go first and you get a decent hand. Of course, you'll want to play Pre-Preparations of Rites these days, since that card's just amazing. But honestly, if you're going to play Herald of Perfection, this isn't the best build. You'd be better off going off with the Cyber Angel variant, which is pretty much broken. Number 12, Toon Thief. No changes required. Toons weren't really all that viable when I first made this deck, and despite getting new support, they've only become less viable. The problem is they still rely entirely on Toon Kingdom for protection. Without it, they can't do anything, and there are even more ways now to banish spell traps than ever, which makes protecting Toon Kingdom nearly impossible. I really tried to make these work again for the modern meta. I mean, this episode was the first one I had that hit over 10k views, so it's got a little bit of a nostalgic thing for me. It's kind of my breakout hit, but I just couldn't get them to work, unfortunately. A sad state of affairs. Deck 13, Dustan Mania. No changes required. This is another troll deck that barely worked when I made the episode and is slightly less viable even now. I'm not sure if you could make it competitive now, but it works about as well as it did, so if you really want to mess with people, you could still play it. Deck 14, Pure Artifacts. No changes required. This deck suffers from the same problem that the Chronomaly Reptilian deck suffers from, and that's rank 5s just ain't what they used to be. Busting out a single Pallades or Tieris just isn't a big enough first move these days. If the TCG got Varja and they brought Malartak back to 3, then these might be able to do something, and I'd probably end up playing them again because I do love this archetype and its mechanics, but at the moment they just aren't competitive enough to really do anything. Number 15, Gishki Mind Crush. No changes required. This is actually still a pretty decent deck. I'd take out the spell-shattering arrows, since pendulums aren't really the powerhouse they were at the time, and replace them with Galaxy Cyclones or even Cosmic Cyclones, but otherwise this is still roughly as powerful now as it was back then. Removing key cards from your opponent's hand is still a really strong play, and Zeal Gigas' 3200 non-targeting removal is a force to be reckoned with. It's just a pity you can't use Pre-Preparations of Rites with this thing, because it would be amazing. Deck 16, Red Eyes Burn. I played Mathematician at 3, which is now at 1. I had actually replaced all 3 of them with Red Eyes Insight when it comes out in Invasion of Vengeance, since it essentially serves the same purpose while also searching. Overall, this is a pretty decent deck that just needs a little updating to be great again. Replace the Silver's Cry with Return of the Dragon Lords for added protection. Replace the Ring of Destruction and maybe the Red Eyes Burn with copies of Blazing Mirror Force. That way you can have more destruction and even greater burn. I'd also throw in some Twin Twisters into the side deck for spell trap removal. Do all that and you've got a pretty competitive burn/beatdown deck. Number 17, Tiny Beast Lockdown. I played Upstart Goblin at 3, which is now limited. I'd replace them with more effect negation since monster effects are more prevalent now, or maybe with some draw power like Into the Void or Dark World Dealings. Overall, this is a really great deck as long as you can go first, and I just remade it for the previous week's episode, so if you want to see what the 2016 version looks like, go ahead and check out that episode. Number 18, Aromatrix. No changes required. This is also still a pretty good deck, although traps in general are a bit slow and a bit difficult to play now, considering how many decks main Twin Twister these days. This deck will certainly benefit from new Trap Hole support or new Aromage support, but I haven't actually looked too big into those yet, so I'm not sure how well it'll fit into this. Still, it's decent as a rogue deck. Deck number 19, Trap Monster Stun. No changes required. And for the 3rd time in a row, we have a deck that is still pretty decent, if not a bit slow due to traps. I've actually been itching to try this out again, hopefully adding Card of Demise and Fog Blades into that since there's so much synergy with those two. So look for that in the near future, hopefully, if I can get it to work. Number 20, Gem Knight Toolbox. No changes required. This is probably one of my better rogue decks. Of all the decks I want to revisit, this one requires the least updating. I mean, Gem Knights haven't gotten any new support since I last played them, and they're still being played at a rogue level pretty decently. They have these crazy combolicious OTKs, just massive attack damage combined with burn damage, and I'm actually looking forward to playing this again just as is in the near future. Number 21, Anti-Meta Ghost Trick Mill. No changes required. And this is probably the best deck I've ever made, as well as my most popular episode to date. It's anti-meta at its finest, and it's still really, really good. I just need to update it with some things to make it even better. Some Burying Mirror Forces, some Floodgate Trap Holes. I'm definitely playing this again. I just need to decide if I'm going to do a burn variant this time, or go for beatdown. Number 22, Normal Pendulum Beatdown. I originally played Rhoda at 3, which is, once again, now limited. I'd replace it with 2 copies of Dark World Dealing, since there are ways to recover cards when you put them in the graveyard. Or perhaps a 3rd Galaxy Cyclone. Actually, Twin Twister would probably be better in this deck given how much graveyard recovery it has, but whatever. If we're being honest, I never really liked this deck. It's kind of a subpar toolbox that doesn't have a really strong win condition. Not sure what I could do to make it relevant either. You'll probably have to ask Captain Cardsworth on this one, it's his design. Number 23, Fluffle OTK. No changes required. This can still OTK almost as well as it could before. Granted, Solemn Strike is its arch nemesis, and the prevalence of floaters and things like Return of the Dragon Lords make OTKs a little more difficult to pull off, but this is almost as good as it was before. I know there's new Fluffle support coming out, but I haven't really looked into it in depth, so I'm not sure yet if any of it's worth running, but I am planning to return to this deck, so I'll probably find out then. Deck 24, the Anti-Special Summon Hole deck. No changes required. This deck is still alright if you go first, but it can be greatly improved with the addition of some new cards and the new ban list. Like most lockdown decks, this will definitely benefit from having 2 Thunder Kings. I'd also replace the Mystical Space Typhoons with Cosmic Cyclones, replace the standard Mirror Forces with Storming Mirror Forces, and of course, add in Moon Mirror Shield, which has become a staple of Barrier Statue decks since it came out. Deck 25, Kaijoodles. No changes required. With the exception of Ghost Tricks, I think this may be one of the trolliest and most frustrating decks I've ever built, and I'm honestly a bit surprised these never became a thing. I mean, Kaijus are still kind of being used to tech in, and it's one thing to tribute your opponent's monster, it's another thing to then steal the monster you gave them and use it to attack them directly. I think this deck is pretty good as is, no real reason to update it except for maybe changing out different Kaijus. And actually, I'd be really interested in playing this again, but I'm more interested in trying out pure kaijus now that they have all their support. Deck 26, Tellarknight Burn. Originally played Rhoda at 3, which is of course now limited. I'd replace it with either 2 Max Cs or maybe 1 Max C and a Foolish Burial, just to give it a little extra draw power. This was a pretty mediocre deck at the time, but surprisingly it hasn't really been power creeped. Burn decks tend to hold their own a little better in the long run, since life point values never change. I'd put Spell Shattering Arrows in the side deck since pendulums aren't as prevalent as they were, and replace them with generic spell trap removal like Twin Twister, but otherwise this is pretty good. Number 27, DDD Fusion Beat. I originally played Mathematician at 3, which is now limited. Replace them with DD Savant Copernicus because it does essentially the same thing. Unfortunately, this deck isn't really relevant at all, not because DDDs are bad, just because there's been so much DDD support released since this episode came out, that if I was trying to do them again, I would just throw out everything and start from scratch. You can't even really compare this deck to a modern DDD deck. If you're looking forward to seeing more DDDs, don't worry, as long as they aren't meta, I shall be looking at them sometime in the far future when all of their support is finally in the TCG. Deck 28, Pure Deskbots. I originally played Wavering Eyes at 3, which is now forbidden completely. I just replaced them with Deskbot Base to keep the consistency. Also originally played Maxi at 3, now that's semi-limited, so I'd replace one with a copy of Deskbot 9. I think this deck is still pretty competitive once you make the changes. I mean, it needs to be updated with some new Deskbot support, but the core is still really strong, and I think there's potential for a powerful OTK beatdown deck. I'll need to test it out more extensively before I can say for sure, though. Also, no idea how I'm going to top my first sleeve designs if I make these again. I mean, look at them. They're just majestic. Number 29, Vylon Castle. Originally played Emergency Teleport at 3, now limited. Not sure what to replace it with. This deck goes along with Master of Oz Dynamite as a deck that barely worked at the time, that probably doesn't work at all now. Even if Emergency Teleport was still at 3, it wouldn't be all that good, and without E-Telly, it's pretty much useless. That card was such a strong part of what made this deck work in the first place, and it doesn't really have anything that you can replace it with, so this deck's pretty much done for. Deck 30, Rank 9 and 10 Trains. No changes required. This deck was more of a proof of concept than an attempt to build an actual competitive rogue deck. Really, I just wanted to make some Rank 9 Ixies, maybe bust out Hard Earth Dragon, and I thought the Train Engine with Level Eater was the best option. And if you want to do that, this still does that fairly well, but it's far from the most effective train deck you could build. I don't feel like adding more stuff to try to make it competitive is really in the spirit of what this was. I plan to go back and make a new train deck at some point that'll just be a completely different topic. Maybe mix it with something else, maybe Shadalls, but I'm not sure. Deck 31, Mecha Phantom Beast Advantage. No changes required. It's weird, going back over all these decks, I can remember how most of them work, but this one I don't remember at all. I don't know what the combos were supposed to be, I forget what the monsters do. The only thing I remember from this episode is that duel where I tricked my opponent into attacking a Metal Fiend token for game. So unfortunately I have no idea if this is still competitive or what I could change to make it better. I assume it's pretty slow by today's standards, probably mediocre at best, and not worth trying unless you just want the gimmick of playing tokens, but maybe someone in the comments can correct me. Number 32, Hunter Toolbox. No changes required. Like Cardsworth's previous deck, the normal Pendulum Beatdown, I never really liked this deck. I mean, it's just rank 4 spam and a fairly slow version at that. There's certainly some potential there. You could add in Rafflesia and Giant Hand for some defensive plays, replace the Threatening Roar with some Trap Holes or Solemn Strike, something that will actually get rid of the monsters. But at the end of the day, this is still just generic rank 4, and those kind of decks aren't my cup of tea. Deck 33, Saturn Burn Stall. No changes required. This is another troll deck that barely worked at the time and is even worse now that there's more monster negation in the game. And unfortunately, I don't think there's much you could do to make it more competitive. It just is what it is. Number 34, the Christmas Gift. No changes required. This deck was a joke that wasn't ever intended to win, in which case it works as good now as it did when I made it. 10 out of 10. Deck 35, Raid Raptor Swarm. No changes required. This is a pretty mediocre Raid Raptor deck. I mean, I still think there's some potential for the Swarm Beatdown variant. I'd like to try it and replace the Necro Vultures with Booster Strix, maybe replace the Zephyros with Last Strix just for a little added potential. But if you really want a good rogue deck, I think Ultimate Falcon Turbo is the way to go. I'm actually surprised that variant never took off. Number 36, Guardian Dreadscythe Turbo. No changes required. This is still the What a Deck with the worst record, and I don't think anything could make it work any better. I did my best with Aimless James' idea, but at the end of the day, it's just a really gimmicky troll deck that's a bit too slow to survive. Number 37, Dino Mist Beatdown. I originally played Emergency Teleport at 2, which is now limited. I would honestly just throw both out and replace them with Despot 001, which is a better synchro engine than trying to use Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. Dino Mists are a bit underrated in my opinion. I mean, this build was a little weak, but with the addition of Cyber Infinity Dragon, the new Dino Mist support, and of course Despot 001, I think they could be really good. I'm actually really looking forward to playing them again, now that I know I had a fan tell me about the Despot 001 in this deck, and I don't know why I don't see it more often. Basically, every time you Pendulum Summon, you get 0-1 out of the graveyard, so it's a renewable Synchro engine. You can just keep summoning Synchros every single turn, which is pretty neat. Deck 38, No Mill Infernoids. No changes required. This is another proof of concept deck that wasn't really intended to be good, so much as it was intended to prove that you can do Infernoids without using Reasoning or Lightsworns. I still think Infernoids have a shot at being good, perhaps mixed with another mill deck, PK Fire Infernoids perhaps. Regardless, I don't really like the archetype all that much, so I don't think I'll be using them again. We'll leave it up to someone else to experiment with that. Number 39, Shiranui Toolbox. No changes required. Put this deck in the group with DDDs as a deck that needs to be completely reworked from the ground up. Not only has there been more Shiranui support since this deck came out, but I incorrectly assumed at the time that Psyframe Lord Omega would eventually be hit on the ban list. Now that it's clear he's here to stay, there's no reason not to play him, which, together with Shiranui Solitaire, makes this an entirely different deck. Deck 40, Super Heavy Samurai OTK. I originally played Max C at 3, but it's now semi-limited. I just replaced one copy with Card D, just an alternative source of draw power. This deck wasn't all that great to begin with, and like most attack-based OTKs, it's only become worse due to the popularity of floater monsters and the sudden surge of 3,000 attack point boss monsters. I'm sure it could be better, but I'm not familiar enough with Super Heavy Samurais to know what I could change, and I don't think I'll be trying them again. Their lack of spell trap support is just a little too restricting for me. Deck 41, Cardsworth's Machina Gadgets. No changes required. This is yet another Cardsworth deck that I don't particularly like. Machina Gadgets are still decent, especially now that they have Gold and Silver Gadget to work with, but I'm not sure what you'd take out of this deck to make a room for them. I'm actually going to ask Captain Cardsworth if he'll take a look at this video and try to respond to your comments if you have any questions for him. Deck 42, Anti-Meta Klee. I originally played Pantheism and Stormforth at 3, both of which are now limited. I'd replace them with Lose One Turn and the Vanity's Emptiness, or just more draw power, maybe Card of Demise if you want to take the popular route. Monarch support was really the last hope that Klee's had as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you could still play them of course, and they do have that new trap card coming out in Invasion Vengeance, but overall the deck is pretty much dead, at least until Scout or Sacrifice come back from 1. Deck 43, Phantom Knight Burning Abyss. I originally played Seer at 2, which is now limited. I would just replace it with Alec for more effect negation. Ah, my old PK Fire deck, made before the term PK Fire was even coined. I wish I could say this started a trend, but my version is nothing like the meta deck that would actually see competitive play. Like my No Mill Infernoids, this was more of a proof of concept than anything. In this case, I was trying to make a deck where every card had an effect that activated in the graveyard, so no matter what you milled with Dante, it was potentially useful. For what it is, it still works pretty good. There are just better PK Fire decks out there. If I redid this now, I'd probably use Alec over Calcab, since monster effects are a little more prevalent than they were, and I'd drop in a Beatrice for good measure. Why not? Deck 44, Forbidden Princess Mill. No changes required. This is still one of my strongest decks up there with Ghost Tricks, and I'm actually kind of surprised it never took off given its strength. If Pre-Preparations doesn't get hit in the next 6 months because of Cyber Angels, I'll be sure to play this again, pretty much as it is, and I'm sure it'll still be useful. Deck 45, Tiger King Stun. I originally played Upstart Goblin at 2, which is now limited. I would just replace it with a Raigeki or another Forbidden Chalice. Here's another really good deck, probably one of my favorites actually. It wouldn't need much updating to be effective against Blue Eyes or ABC Dragon Cannon, so I'd say run pretty much as is. Like the Forbidden Princess Mill, I'm looking forward to playing this one again, pretty much unchanged once its year comes up. Number 46, Mirror Force Grind. I originally played Chicken Game at 3, which is now forbidden. Replace it with Crush Card Virus, or just more Mirror Forces. I actually said during this episode that I wanted to play Doom Virus Dragon, but it was too inconsistent with Crush Card at 1. Now that Crush Card is unlimited, though, it seems like the perfect replacement for Chicken Game. Of course, this is another troll deck that wasn't too competitive to begin with, but it's a little bit more competitive than most of my other troll decks, and I think it could be even better with the addition of Crush Card Virus. Number 47, Gladiator Beast Beatbox. No changes required. I personally don't think this deck needs any changes or updates. I like it as is. But then again, as much as I like Gladiator Beasts, I don't think I'm very good at building them. At least taking what I've seen in the comments. If you want a Gladiator Beast deck to play against the modern meta, this one is decent, but there are certainly better builds out there if you're willing to look around. Deck 48, Lunalight Fusion Extreme. I originally played Upstart Goblin at 3, which is now limited, and I played Crimson Fox at 3, which was never released in the TCG at all. That's 5 total cards that need replacing. So Lunalight Perfume will take up 3 of those spaces. The final 2, I would say either a 3rd copy of Dark Eruption and King of the Swamp, 2 Max C's, or 2 Twin Twisters, depending on your taste. This is actually my most disliked video. Not that it has a whole bunch of dislikes, but more than I'm used to. I got a lot of people in the comments telling me I don't know how to play Lunalights properly, and they're probably right. Like with Gladiator Beasts, I really like Lunalights. I think they're a great archetype with the potential to be competitive, but I don't think I'm very good at them, so I'm not sure how I would improve this deck. Number 49, rank up 7th Sylvans. No changes required. Not really much to say here. I mean, this is just another trolly fun deck that works about as good in the current game as it did 6 months ago. Play it as is. Have fun. Deck 50, Dragon Destroyer Turbo. No changes required. This is not only another deck made by someone else, but also a deck that has received a bit of support since I made the episode. I'm not sure if I'll do Buster Bladers again, but if I do, I'll probably completely remake this deck from scratch without things like DNA Surgery or Galaxy Dragon. Number 51, Nimble Earthbound Super Ancient Synchro. No changes required. This deck just fits the spirit of the What a Deck so well. I mean, here we have a rogue deck that uses mostly old cards, that takes the new ban list allowing Trishula, and just makes full use of it. It doesn't work great, but it works as good now as it did back then, and it doesn't need any updating. Mission accomplished as far as I'm concerned. Finally, we have Spirits, my favorite deck, and the 52nd episode, marking the 1st year anniversary. Unfortunately, it got hit by the ban list pretty hard, and I'm not exactly sure how to change it yet. I originally played Maxi at 3, we can now only have 2 of those, and I played the Monarch Storm 4th at 3, which we can now only have 1 of. My personal Spirit deck was always something I continually tweaked as I played. It took a lot of experimentation that unfortunately I don't have time for these days between YouTube and my day job. Still, if I was going to update it, I'd start by looking at either Soul Exchange, Card Advance, or Tribute Burial to replace the Monarch Storm 4th. They all have their advantages and disadvantages, so it's difficult to say which one would be the best choice without testing them, but they're all candidates. I'd also run 1 less Fen Shuang, since traps are going out of style at the moment, and I might even drop the Dark Dust Spirits down as well, focus instead on running Higo Kago Sushi or even Aratama. I've said before that I didn't think Aratama was worth it because it took 2 tributes, but Tribute Burial kind of makes that a game changer because it makes summoning of 2 tribute monsters much easier. I might also drop in a Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries just because it's the ultimate in anti-meta trolling. Of course, there's also the newly announced Ritual Spirit monster, which is just insanity. I never thought I'd live to see the day, but I'm glad. It's really kind of a strong boss monster, and it helps get your other boss monsters out even quicker. Of course, this is all speculation. There's no way to know for sure what I'll do until next May, when I play Spirits again for the 2nd anniversary. Hopefully you guys will still be with me when I get there, and hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'm really curious as to what you thought about this little excursion into the past. Be sure to like or dislike the video accordingly, and comment in the comments with your thoughts. Let me know if this is something you'd like to see again next year, if you'd like me to tweak the format a little bit. Of course, next week I should be back to my old What a Deck shenanigans, hopefully with a rogue twist on one of the day's more popular decks. Until then, as always, good luck and have fun.